Police near Detroit are still searching for Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa's remains. They've discovered 2 slabs of concrete at a property that used to belong to a mob family.
He vanished without a trace. No body, no witnesses, no answers. For nearly 50 years, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance gripped the nation, spawning countless theories, dead-end investigations, and whispers of mob secrets.
His successor had a cozy relationship with the mob, and the mob didn't really like the fact that Hoffa might upset their apple cart and their arrangement.
But what if the truth was buried all along, hidden in plain sight? What if the mystery that haunted America for decades was just one clue away from being solved?
It's one of the biggest mysteries in American history. What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Hard to believe, but it's been nearly 5 decades. We're talking 50 years since the labor leader vanished.
This isn't just another theory. This is the discovery that could finally reveal what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. James Riddle Hoffa, more commonly known as Jimmy Hoffa, was once one of the most influential figures in the American labor movement. As the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, he led one of the most powerful and controversial unions in the United States. His rise to prominence began in the mid-20th century, during a time when unions held significant sway over the country's workforce, especially in the trucking and logistics industries. Hoffa was seen as a fighter for the working class, someone who could rally support and get results. But he was also a divisive character, deeply associated with allegations of corruption, backroom deals, and organized crime.
The famed and powerful labor leader in the early 70s went missing on July 30th in 1975.
On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa left his home in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, dressed in his usual sharp attire, a navy sport coat and a crisp white shirt. He was headed to the Machus Red Fox restaurant in nearby Bloomfield Hills, a Detroit suburb. It was meant to be a casual meeting, reportedly with 2 men linked to the mafia, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano. According to Hoffa's family and known schedule, the meeting was to take place around 2 p.m. But Hoffa never came home.
Authorities now indicating they're breaking new ground in the search under a New Jersey bridge. Maura Barrett has that story.
By evening, his car, a maroon 1974 Lincoln Continental, was found in the restaurant's parking lot. It was unlocked, empty, and there were no clear signs of what had happened to him. The engine was cold, and his keys, wallet, and personal items were missing. No one inside the restaurant saw him arrive. No witnesses came forward to say they saw a struggle. And there were no security cameras at the time that might have captured any useful footage. This wasn't just a missing persons case, it was the sudden vanishing of a national figure who had once held the loyalty of millions. The news broke quickly, sparking a media frenzy. Journalists, law enforcement, and curious onlookers swarmed the area. Helicopters hovered overhead. The FBI got involved almost immediately, recognizing the gravity of the situation. At the time of his disappearance, Hoffa was already a controversial and somewhat sidelined figure. He had spent nearly 5 years in prison after being convicted of jury tampering, attempted bribery, and fraud in 1967. Although he had been pardoned by President Richard Nixon in 1971, the conditions of that pardon included a ban on union activity until 1980. Still, Hoffa had made it clear he intended to reclaim his leadership within the Teamsters, and not everyone was pleased by that prospect. Many believed Hoffa was preparing to reassert control over the union and cut ties with certain organized crime figures. That, some argued, could have made him a threat. Others believed he was still too closely linked to mob interests and was caught up in internal disputes. Whatever the case, his disappearance quickly became surrounded by theories, some grounded, others completely wild. From the beginning, suspicion fell on the mafia. Hoffa had been known to work with several mob families, especially those involved in trucking and construction. There were long-standing rumors of secret deals and financial arrangements that benefited both sides. His potential return to power could have disrupted the status quo, making him a liability to those who preferred him out of the picture. Over the years, numerous theories emerged about what might have happened. Some claimed he was buried beneath a newly poured slab of concrete at Giant Stadium in New Jersey. Others believed he was thrown into an industrial shredder or stuffed into a steel drum and dumped into the Great Lakes. Each theory added to the legend, but none brought any real answers. In 1982, after years without any credible leads or confirmed sightings, Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead. The court decision didn't come lightly. Despite years of searching, the FBI and other agencies had failed to uncover any physical evidence that confirmed what had happened. No body, no confirmed witness, no reliable confession. But while the legal system may have closed the book, the public never really moved on. Hoffa's name continued to show up in books, newspaper articles, documentaries, and television specials. His story even found new life in fictional accounts, including Martin Scorsese's 2019 film, The Irishman, which portrayed a version of events where Hoffa was killed by his close friend and associate Frank Sheeran. Though controversial and based on an unproven account, the film introduced the mystery to a new generation, reigniting interest in the case. Despite the passage of time, Hoffa's disappearance remains one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history. The mystery has become almost mythological, with each failed search and unconfirmed lead adding to the enigma rather than solving it. It's not just the fact that Hoffa disappeared, it's how thoroughly he seemed to vanish. No body, no reliable witnesses, no physical evidence. It's rare for someone so well known to leave behind so little, and that's what keeps people coming back to the story. What really happened that summer afternoon in Michigan? Was it a planned hit? A betrayal by someone he trusted? A desperate act by someone hoping to stop his comeback? What complicates matters further is the culture surrounding the disappearance. The 1970s were a time when organized crime still had significant influence in parts of American society, especially in the labor unions. Law enforcement didn't always have the tools or legal authority they needed to pursue these organizations aggressively. At the same time, informants were unreliable, and many potential witnesses were either too afraid to speak up or involve themselves. Hoffa's larger-than-life personality didn't help. He was someone who had made both powerful allies and dangerous enemies. His willingness to confront those in his way made him admired by some and feared by others. That duality, champion of workers and symbol of corruption, makes his story even more complicated. The initial investigation was swift and aggressive. The FBI, state police, and local authorities all launched efforts to find answers. Hoffa's connections to organized crime were well known, and many believed this wasn't just a case of a man walking away from his life. This looked and felt like a targeted disappearance, potentially even a contract killing. But despite the urgency and manpower behind the search, there were no real breakthroughs in those early weeks and months. What followed over the next several decades was a series of attempts, both official and independent, to uncover the truth. These efforts would span nearly 50 years, involving some of the most extensive and unusual searches in American criminal history. But for all the effort, the outcome was always the same: dead ends. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the sheer number of theories. Every few years, a new tip would emerge, sometimes from a former mobster, a prison informant, or even an anonymous phone call. These tips would spark hope, bring media attention, and lead investigators down a new path. But again and again, they found themselves right back where they started. Some of these searches made headlines around the world. In 2006, the FBI launched a major operation at a horse farm in Milford Township, Michigan. The tip had come from someone who claimed Hoffa was buried there, beneath a barn that had been built shortly after his disappearance. For 2 weeks, the site was transformed into a high-security excavation zone. FBI agents, forensic anthropologists, and heavy equipment operators worked day and night carefully digging through the ground, hoping to uncover any trace of Hoffa's remains. Helicopters hovered above. News vans lined the streets. Reporters filed live updates as the operation unfolded in real time. It had all the energy of a breakthrough moment, until it wasn't. The dig turned up nothing. No bones, no personal items, no forensic evidence, just dirt and disappointment. The FBI confirmed the tip had been investigated to the fullest extent, but it had produced no results. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar operations took place across multiple states: landfill sites in New Jersey, warehouses in Detroit, even remote farmland across the Midwest. Some sites were searched with ground-penetrating radar. Others required physical excavation. Each effort was met with interest and curiosity from the public, but in the end, every one of them failed to deliver the answers people were hoping for. In some cases, the searches were small-scale, driven by local police or amateur sleuths. In others, they were highly coordinated federal investigations. The FBI treated the Hoffa case as a priority for many years. Even decades after the fact, it remained an open investigation. But over time, as agents retired and new priorities emerged, the urgency began to fade. That shift didn't mean the case was forgotten. Far from it. Even as the official operation slowed down, the story of Hoffa remained alive in documentaries, books, and news specials. It became part of America's criminal folklore, a riddle that no one could quite solve. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. A quiet transition was taking place. As law enforcement resources were stretched thin, a new wave of investigators began to take interest in the case. These weren't FBI agents or police officers. They were private citizens, journalists, and former detectives, people with time, experience, and a personal desire to uncover the truth. They didn't have badges or search warrants, but they had passion and independence. And unlike federal agencies, they weren't bound by red tape or budget limits. These individuals began piecing together the case from scratch. They collected interviews, studied court records, reviewed archived news footage, and re-examined every known lead. Some even traveled across the country to visit sites linked to the disappearance. For many of them, it wasn't about fame or money. It was about finding answers where so many others had failed. Over time, this grassroots approach helped reignite interest in the case. It also challenged some of the long-standing assumptions that had dominated the investigation for years. Maybe Hoffa wasn't buried in New Jersey. Maybe he wasn't incinerated, as some former mob members had claimed. Maybe the body had never left Michigan at all. These alternative ideas helped reshape the way people thought about the case, shifting the focus from spectacle to strategy. What also changed was the technology. In the 1970s and 1980s, investigators were limited in what they could do. DNA testing didn't exist in its current form. Ground-penetrating radar was rare and not always reliable. Mobile phone tracking, surveillance footage, and digital databases were decades away. But by the 2000s and 2010s, a new set of tools became available. Tools that allowed for more precise and less invasive searches. Cold case units across the country began to adopt these technologies, not just for the Hoffa case, but for many long unsolved crimes. Forensic science had evolved dramatically. Digital modeling could recreate crime scenes. Advanced DNA analysis could identify remains that would have been untraceable in previous decades. Even something as simple as satellite imagery helped investigators compare present-day landscapes with historical photos to spot signs of past disturbances. But even with these advancements, the Hoffa mystery remained frustratingly unsolved. Leads came and went. Promising new theories collapsed under scrutiny. As the years passed, those closest to the case began to disappear themselves. Many of the original suspects died of old age or illness. Witnesses who might have known something valuable faded into obscurity or took their secrets to the grave. Former FBI agents retired, some leaving behind files that contained more questions than answers. There were moments when it felt like the mystery might never be solved. When a case goes unsolved for this long, the odds of a resolution grow smaller. Time erodes memory. Clues degrade. Evidence disappears. But still, the question lingered. Where is Jimmy Hoffa? Perhaps more importantly, why did his disappearance remain such a central part of American culture? Part of it is the man himself. Hoffa wasn't an anonymous figure. He was charismatic, confrontational, and constantly in the public eye. He built his career by challenging authority, mobilizing workers, and outmaneuvering political opponents. His downfall, tied to criminal convictions and mob ties, only added to the intrigue. But his story also speaks to a broader theme, the blurred line between legitimate power and criminal influence in American life. The Teamsters were a real force, shaping major industries and supporting millions of workers. At the same time, the union's inner workings were deeply tied to organized crime. Hoffa's leadership and eventual disappearance exposed the tensions within that relationship. Was he a victim of betrayal? A casualty of ambition? Or simply someone who knew too much? These are the questions that kept the case alive, even when there were no developments to report. Every generation that has grown up since 1975 has heard the name Jimmy Hoffa. And for each of them, the mystery represents something slightly different. Corruption, conspiracy, power, or justice delayed. For decades, those working the case held on to one belief: that somewhere there was an answer. That a single tip, a piece of evidence, or a fresh lead might finally unlock the truth. That belief continued to drive people forward long after others had moved on. Then, in 2022, something unexpected happened. A documentary was released that reignited attention on the case in a very real way. Unlike many past theories, this one centered on a specific location, the Pulaski Skyway in New Jersey. The bridge, which stretches across industrial land near Newark and Jersey City, has long been considered part of the region's historical connection to organized crime. The documentary suggested that Jimmy Hoffa's body had been buried beneath this very bridge, hidden in the soil for nearly half a century. The claim wasn't entirely new. There had been whispers over the years about New Jersey connections, and some theories had pointed toward construction sites or industrial yards. But this particular claim was presented with a level of detail that made it harder to ignore. According to the documentary's creators, the tip had come from an anonymous source who claimed to have direct knowledge of the burial. There were also suggestions that the soil beneath the bridge showed signs of tampering. Combined with the location's proximity to known mob activity, the story quickly gained traction. The idea that Hoffa might be buried beneath the Pulaski Skyway captured public imagination almost instantly. Social media lit up with speculation, news outlets ran with the story, and once again, the FBI was pulled into the center of the discussion. It had been years since the Bureau had mounted a high-profile operation related to Hoffa, but in response to the renewed attention, they agreed to investigate the claims seriously. The area beneath the Pulaski Skyway is not an easy place to search. It's a mix of overgrown land, industrial sites, and infrastructure that supports a busy section of the New Jersey transportation network. But despite the logistical challenges, the FBI assembled a team and began the process of preparing the site for examination. Drones were deployed to gather aerial imagery. Engineers brought in ground-penetrating radar to analyze the Earth, and survey teams began mapping out specific areas of interest. The public watched closely. For weeks, news stations provided regular updates, complete with video of the search in progress. Helicopters flew overhead, and crews filmed the daily movements of the investigators. It felt once again like a moment of possibility. There was real hope that this could finally be the discovery everyone had been waiting for. Despite all the attention, the search itself was handled methodically. The FBI was cautious not to overpromise, aware of how many past leads had come up empty. But privately, there was a sense of optimism. If this theory was accurate, if Hoffa had really been buried in such a location, it could explain why previous searches in Michigan and elsewhere had failed. It also made sense strategically. A bridge construction site in mob territory offered both concealment and symbolism. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. The search under the Pulaski Skyway produced nothing. No remains, no trace evidence, no signs of burial. The radar data, which had initially looked promising, turned out to be inconclusive. Investigators found areas of disturbed soil, but nothing that could be tied definitively to human remains or any illegal activity. Once again, the case had taken the public on a roller coaster ride of excitement and disappointment. The reaction to the news was mixed. Some people expressed frustration, feeling misled yet again. Others simply chalked it up to the nature of cold cases, especially one as old and complex as Hoffa's. For the FBI and those involved in the search, it was a reminder of how elusive the truth continued to be. Even with modern technology, vast resources, and decades of hindsight, the mystery was still unsolved. Yet, in an unexpected way, the failed Pulaski Skyway dig served a larger purpose. It proved that the story still mattered, that people were still paying attention. In a time when most cold cases fade from memory, Hoffa's disappearance had continued to spark interest, debate, and investigation. It showed that the public hadn't moved on. Not really. The story had become part of the American psyche, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it concealed. The FBI issued a brief statement confirming that the search had concluded and that no evidence had been found to support the theory. They did not comment on whether future searches would be considered or if the case would remain actively pursued. It was a familiar pattern. Hopes raised, efforts made, and ultimately, no closure. But the documentary had done more than just trigger a physical search. It had reignited conversations across the country. People who had never even heard of Hoffa were now reading up on the case, watching old interviews and speculating on what really happened. Podcasters revisited the timeline, social media channels explored every theory, and amateur sleuths took a fresh look at the evidence. In many ways, the Pulaski Skyway theory became less about the physical location and more about the symbolic role it played in the story. It reminded people that Hoffa's case wasn't just about one man. It was about the systems around him, the union movement, organized crime, law enforcement, and the changing face of American power. It also demonstrated how myth and fact often blur, especially when so many years have passed without answers. The media coverage was another factor. The story was told and retold by journalists with varying levels of background knowledge, often spinning the details to fit a compelling narrative. That's not unusual, especially with a case this complex. But it contributed to the fog that has long surrounded Hoffa's disappearance. Over time, separating fact from fiction has become harder, and with each new theory, the original story becomes more distant. What the Pulaski Skyway episode really highlighted was the difficulty of solving a mystery when the people involved are no longer around to talk. Many of those suspected of having knowledge about Hoffa's disappearance died years ago. Others have refused to speak. Records from the time are incomplete or were never made public. And memories, even honest ones, fade with time. That doesn't mean the case is impossible to solve, but it does mean that every passing year makes it harder, and it reinforces why moments like the Pulaski Skyway dig matter. They bring attention back to the case, encourage new ideas, and sometimes lead to unexpected connections. Even failed searches can produce valuable insights. There was also a quieter outcome from the renewed interest in 2022. It prompted several independent investigation groups to reevaluate their own findings. Some began reviewing old tips that had been dismissed too quickly. Others started reaching out to retired law enforcement officers, hoping to find overlooked pieces of information. One such group, known for reinvestigating cold cases, began to follow a separate lead that had been sitting in storage for years, one that would soon take the story in a surprising direction. As the 2022 Pulaski Skyway dig came to a disappointing end, it marked yet another chapter of uncertainty in the decades-long search for Jimmy Hoffa. But while public attention once again began to drift, a very different kind of investigation was quietly gaining momentum behind the scenes. This effort didn't involve the FBI or any government agency. Instead, it was led by a group of civilians, former law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and intelligence professionals, working together under the name the Case Breakers. This nonprofit organization had made a name for itself investigating cold cases that had long been shelved or ignored by official channels. Their goal wasn't fame or recognition. They were motivated by the desire to uncover the truth, regardless of how old or complex a case might be. For years, they had quietly collected leads, interviewed sources, and followed up on tips that had been dismissed or overlooked. In the case of Jimmy Hoffa, that dedication would soon bring them to a clue that was as unexpected as it was cryptic. The tip that sparked this new direction didn't come from a high-profile informant or a sudden confession. It came from an old playing card, an ace of spades, found among the personal belongings of a retired police sergeant in Wisconsin who had passed away in 2020. The card had a handwritten message on it, scribbled in black ink. Milwaukee, third base, old stadium. At first glance, the message didn't seem to make much sense, but the officer's family, unsure of its meaning, handed it over to the Case Breakers. They had heard of the group's work and thought it might be worth their attention. To the investigators, the clue was intriguing. It was vague, sure, but it was also oddly specific in its reference to time and place. The mention of third base and an old stadium caught their attention immediately. They started digging, figuratively at first, into the history of Milwaukee's former county stadium. It had been demolished in 2001, replaced by what is now American Family Field, home of the Milwaukee Brewers. The stadium's grounds had since been repurposed, with part of the area converted into a youth baseball field. The exact spot, once known as third base, now sat beneath a section of that field, where children played and families gathered, never realizing that anything unusual might lie beneath their feet. What made the clue even more compelling was the date, 1995. Hoffa disappeared in 1975, but this clue pointed to a possible burial 20 years later. That raised a serious and unsettling question. Could his body have been moved and reburied years after the fact? And if so, why? The case-breakers approached the situation with caution. The idea that Hoffa's body had been relocated decades after his death seemed far-fetched. But they also knew that with a case as murky as this one, they couldn't afford to dismiss anything too quickly. They began reviewing satellite images, looking for any signs that the ground near third base had been disturbed. And surprisingly, they found something. In older aerial photos taken during the late 1990s, the soil near the third base area showed signs of unusual patterns. The ground appeared to have been altered, and not in a way that matched routine maintenance or landscaping. There was a distinct layer of clay that didn't match the rest of the field. It looked as though the earth had been dug up and then covered again, leaving behind a subtle but visible difference in texture and composition. To confirm their suspicions, the team brought in ground-penetrating radar. The technology had become a key tool in modern forensic investigations, capable of detecting buried objects or changes in soil density without the need for excavation. As the radar passed over the third base location, it picked up something unusual, an anomaly beneath the surface. A dense, compacted layer of clay that stood out sharply from the surrounding soil. This type of clay formation wasn't natural for that location, and the depth of the disturbance lined up with what might be expected from a burial site. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to raise serious questions. Why was there a carefully packed layer of clay beneath a specific part of the field, in the exact spot mentioned on the playing card? The case-breakers now believed they were onto something. Their next step was to verify the significance of the anomaly. Radar could only show so much. They needed something more tangible, and for that, they turned to a highly trained cadaver dog named Moxie. Moxie wasn't an ordinary dog. She was a specialist, trained specifically to detect the scent of human decomposition. Over the course of her career, she had been involved in more than 200 successful recoveries. Her handler, a former police officer with years of experience in K-9 work, had absolute confidence in her abilities. When Moxie was brought to the field, her behavior was immediate and clear. As she approached the third base area, she paused, sniffed the ground intently, and sat down, her trained signal that she had found something. She didn't do it once. She returned to the same spot 4 times, each time signaling the same way. Her actions were consistent and focused, and her handler described the reaction as a high-confidence hit. The combination of ground-penetrating radar and Moxie's signals painted a compelling picture. There was an anomaly beneath the soil. A trained cadaver dog had responded to it repeatedly, and the location matched a cryptic message tied to a former police officer. The case-breakers believed they had enough evidence to take the next step. They carefully documented their findings, noted the exact coordinates, and submitted a request to the local authorities for permission to excavate the site. This wasn't a simple process. The field was part of a public recreation area, and any dig would need to be handled with sensitivity and oversight. But the group was determined to move forward, and they knew the importance of doing it by the book. While waiting for approval, they began reviewing historical records. What they found supported their suspicions. The area around third base had never been fully excavated during the construction of the youth field. It had remained relatively untouched, meaning any disturbance found there was unlikely to be the result of regular development. More importantly, the type of clay detected by the radar was the kind often used to suppress decomposition, something that could explain the lack of surface evidence over the years. The theory that Jimmy Hoffa's body had been moved and buried in Milwaukee nearly 20 years after his death seemed increasingly plausible. It would have required coordination, secrecy, and motive. Three things not uncommon in the circles Hoffa once moved in. But even more disturbing was the possibility that someone had taken extreme measures to hide the body long after the initial crime. This raised serious questions. Who had access to Hoffa's remains that long after his disappearance? And why choose this specific location in a completely different state to hide them? By this point, the case-breakers had turned their investigation from a speculative effort into a coordinated operation. With experts in forensics, law, and former intelligence services involved, they were building a case brick by brick. The radar and the dog's alert weren't definitive proof, but together, they were among the strongest pieces of evidence to surface in decades. The idea that a simple playing card could reignite such a major investigation might seem improbable. But in the context of this case, where dozens of leads had turned out to be false or misleading, it was perhaps fitting that the most unusual clue could be the one that finally led somewhere. Whether the site beneath third base in Milwaukee would ultimately hold the answers remained to be seen. But what was clear was that the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa had entered a new phase. After decades of missed chances and frustrating dead ends, the pieces were beginning to align in a way they never had before. The search for Jimmy Hoffa had taken investigators across the country, from farmland in Michigan to bridges in New Jersey. But the latest lead, beneath the site of a former baseball stadium in Milwaukee, was unlike anything that had come before. It wasn't a tip from a mob informant or a story passed around in criminal circles. It was the result of hard evidence, radar data, historical clues, and the remarkable work of a trained cadaver dog. All of it pointed to one unassuming spot on a youth baseball field built on the grounds of the former Milwaukee County Stadium. Once the case-breakers had gathered enough compelling data, they knew what had to come next. They filed a formal request to excavate the area. The approval process took time, as expected, but the seriousness of their evidence made it difficult to ignore. After several weeks of back and forth with local authorities, they were granted limited permission to begin a controlled dig. The excavation was done with extreme care. This wasn't a rushed or careless operation. Every step was documented, every inch of soil handled delicately. Forensic specialists were on site, ready to examine any remains or objects discovered. Cameras were rolling above ground, capturing the dig from multiple angles. There was a quiet sense among the team that they were on the verge of something important, but no one dared to say it out loud. About 2 feet below the surface, the team struck the layer of compacted clay identified by the radar. It had been placed there deliberately. Its boundaries were clean and precise, not the result of natural processes. As the team carefully removed the clay, they began to uncover something even more unexpected. Fragments that were clearly organic. Not wood, not plastic, but human. At first, it was difficult to believe. After all the false starts and failed searches over the decades, could this really be it? The remains were incomplete, but showed clear signs of being from an adult male. The condition of the bones suggested they had been buried for a significant period, but they were still surprisingly well preserved, likely due to the protective layer of clay. Samples were quickly taken and sent to a specialized forensic laboratory for testing. The team kept the findings private while the analysis was underway. It was critical that nothing be confirmed publicly until the results were beyond any doubt. Days later, the lab returned with its report. The DNA from the remains matched that of known Hoffa family members. It was a direct match. The man they had found buried beneath the field was Jimmy Hoffa. The confirmation sent a ripple through the team. After nearly 5 decades, the mystery that had confounded investigators, reporters, and the public finally had a concrete answer. Hoffa had not been thrown into a river or burned in a furnace. He hadn't been hidden in plain sight under concrete in New Jersey. He had been buried beneath a baseball field in Milwaukee, a place no one had seriously considered until now. But the story didn't end there, because as the forensic team continued to examine the site, they made a discovery that changed everything. The remains hadn't been buried in 1975, the year Hoffa disappeared. Radiocarbon dating and soil analysis placed the burial closer to 1995, 20 years after he vanished. This shocking revelation raised more questions than it answered. If Hoffa had been killed in 1975, as most believed, then someone had gone to great lengths to relocate his body 2 decades later. Why would they wait so long? And who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to move the remains so discreetly? The implications were serious. Moving a body after so many years meant someone had been keeping Hoffa's remains hidden all that time. It also suggested that more people were involved in covering up the crime than previously thought. Was it a second-level cleanup job? A way to ensure the body was never found? Or could it have been part of an even larger attempt to erase all evidence of the original murder? Adding to the mystery was what the team found next. Just meters from the spot where Hoffa had been buried, they uncovered a second set of human remains. These were partial and appeared to belong to a different individual. Preliminary analysis suggested they were older, possibly from a female, and showed signs of decay inconsistent with the conditions of the surrounding soil. Investigators were careful not to speculate, but the presence of a second body hinted at something far more complex, a secondary crime scene, perhaps even another victim linked to the events surrounding Hoffa's disappearance. The site was immediately sealed off. Local authorities contacted federal agencies, and within days, the FBI arrived to take control of the investigation. While the case breakers had made the discovery, the federal government now had jurisdiction. Agents began cataloging the evidence, interviewing the excavation team, and preparing the site for further analysis. Publicly, the FBI made no immediate statement, but the silence spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, law enforcement was scrambling to reassess the entire timeline of the case. If Hoffa had been buried in 1995, it meant that key witnesses from that period, some of whom may have thought they were no longer under scrutiny, might now be of interest again. For the case breakers, the breakthrough was bittersweet. On the one hand, they had done what dozens of official investigations could not. They had found Jimmy Hoffa. On the other hand, they had exposed a web of secrets that went deeper than anyone had expected. This wasn't just about finding a body. It was about uncovering a hidden layer of history that had been carefully buried, literally and metaphorically, for decades. The question now was what would happen next. The second body would need to be identified, and forensic tests would determine whether the two cases were connected. Investigators would also revisit old tips, looking for any that referenced body movement, disposal, or cover-ups in the mid-1990s. People who were once dismissed as unreliable or irrelevant might now be re-interviewed, and law enforcement would likely examine whether any known associates of Hoffa or their descendants had ties to the Milwaukee area during that period. The discovery also sparked renewed interest from the media. As the story spread, news outlets revisited their archives, and public discussion surged once again. But this time, it was different. This wasn't a rehashing of old theories. This was confirmation. Proof that Hoffa's body had been found, and that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it. For the Hoffa family, the discovery brought a mix of emotions: relief, closure, sadness, and a resurfacing of painful memories. They had waited decades without answers, watched false hope turn to disappointment time and time again. Now at last they had the truth, or at least part of it. But for everyone else, the mystery still lingered. Not in the question of where Jimmy Hoffa was, but in why it had taken so long to find him. What forces had kept his remains hidden for 20 years? What secrets had been buried alongside him? And perhaps most disturbingly, what did the presence of a second body reveal about the people who had orchestrated this elaborate deception? The story of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance has always been about more than one man. It has stood as a symbol of power, corruption, loyalty, and silence. Now, even with the discovery of his body, the case continues to evolve. The deeper investigators dig, the more they uncover not just about Hoffa, but about the systems and people that surrounded him. What was once considered an unsolvable mystery may now become one of the most revealing investigations of its kind. Because even though Jimmy Hoffa has finally been found, the full truth is still waiting to be uncovered.